Welcome to the 2009 Community Lecture Series, sponsored by the University of Montana Alumni Association. It's great to see such a good crowd out this evening for this opening lecture. My name is Royce Engstrom. I'm the provost here at the University of Montana, and it's a real pleasure to spend this evening with you listening to the first of these 6 lectures in this series, Hidden Montana, Dispelling Myths. As did many of you, I had the pleasure last year of attending some of the lectures in this series. And I have to say they were thoroughly enjoyable and just tremendously educational. It's really a remarkable community that develops and supports a lecture series such as this one. This series, I think, is an indicator of really exceptional relationships between the community of Missoula and the surrounding area and the University of Montana. Many universities struggle to develop a relationship with their community. Oftentimes, the university has trouble gaining the interest of the community in what's going on. The community often has trouble understanding the relevance of what happens at the university on a day-to-day basis. So it's a real accomplishment in this community that we've developed the kind of relationship that lets us have a series of this type, and one that is so well attended by folks who are part of the university in some way. If you read in the Sunday Missoulian, they had a nice story on this event, and it told us that the series began 11 years ago. A small group with folks like Ann Boone and Kitty Robbins leading the way developed the idea that a community lecture series was a way for the community to hear from some of the university's leading experts and great professors. And we have so many of them that I know they have a difficult time choosing which lecturers to go with in any given series. The matters that the series has addressed range all over the world. And if you recall, last year we were focused mainly on the Middle East and some of the problems and situations that we face as a country and as a nation there. And so it's very nice to come home, if you will, and focus here on Montana. So as someone who has still been here a relatively short time in my second year, this title, Hidden Montana, Dispelling Myths, is one of great interest to me. In the time that I've been here, I can tell you with great certainty that I've heard quite a few myths about Montana, about the university, and it's often hard to separate fact from myth. In fact, I know that I've heard a few myths from some of the people that are going to be speaking in this series over the next several weeks. But even those of you who have lived your entire life around here, I'm sure will find new things, new information, and great education about topics that you've heard about for many, many years. As citizens, I think we have the responsibility to learn about the area in which we live and to learn about its connectedness to the rest of the world, past, present, and future. And what better way to do that than to hear from the 6 experts that we're going to listen to over these next several weeks. The committee has selected just an outstanding set of presenters, in my opinion, each of whom has dedicated much of his or her life to the topic that they will discuss with us. I won't go through the list of speakers because you have those in the program, and I'm sure that most of them are familiar to you. So I do urge you to read through the program at your leisure to learn a little bit more about each of the presenters. As citizens, we also have the responsibility to continue learning and to continue pushing ourselves to explore beyond our own area of expertise, our own area of experience. It's gratifying in that regard to see the wide range of ages here in the audience tonight. And those of you who are perhaps beyond the traditional age of students are sending a powerful message to today's students about the importance of learning, about the importance of staying connected to your community and to your university. So for those students who are in the crowd tonight, it's a wonderful thing to see multiple generations in the process of learning on a day-to-day basis. Let me take a moment to thank the Community Lecture Series Advisory Committee, the names of whom are listed at the bottom of the front page of your program. And if I don't know how many of them are here tonight, but could we ask the advisory committee members that are here to just stand and we'll recognize them? I'm not sure if they're here. We'll recognize them in any case. Oh, let's give them a hand wherever they are. Oh, there's Don, you're right there. There's one right there. I also want to thank the Alumni Association and their support for this event, and particularly the work of Kelsey Crawford, who has done the work behind the scenes. Kelsey, would you just stand and let us recognize you? Where did she go? Oh, there, she's in the back row. Well, again, thank you for attending, and at this point, I will turn the program over to Professor of History, Dan Flores. Dan?
Thank you, Provost Engstrom and the Alumni Association, and thank all of you for coming out tonight. I think this is going to be quite a treat. I have the fun tonight of moderating the evening, and that includes the introduction of the speaker, my friend for these almost 20 years that I've been at the University of Montana, Bill Farr, who was the chair of the Department of History when I came here in the early 1990s. Bill, in fact, I think almost single-handedly hired me and got me to come here, and so I've been indebted to him ever since, and have admired him usually from a distance, but sometimes a little more intimately when we've gone off to conferences and things together for a long time. And so it really thrills me to get to hear him speak, and I think you're going to feel the same way. For one thing, Bill is kind of indispensable to this university. He's been here since 1967. That's 42 years, I believe, and that's remarkable in every way. I was in high school in 1967, so it really kind of astonishes me. But what really makes him irreplaceable at the University of Montana is that this man is a medieval historian, trained as a medieval historian. And you'll notice what's behind me on the screen seems to be rather far from anyone's idea of medieval history. In fact, the reason he's irreplaceable is because there's no possible way the history department could put together a job description for a medieval historian who could teach Blackfeet history at the University of Montana. I think the reason Bill is a Blackfeet historian is because he did what so many of us do here. He got into the local place. He found himself in Montana. He was intrigued by the mountains. He was intrigued by the people. The Blackfeet beckoned, and he answered the call. And he became, in most ways, the leading expert, really, on the Blackfeet at the University of Montana and probably in the Northwest, if not the entire American West, for over the last decade or so. I want to give you some idea of exactly what that has meant to local culture here. In 1984, our medieval historian at the University of Montana, and this was long before I came here, published a book, and it was a book that I actually owned before I ever lived in Missoula, called The Reservation Blackfeet, 1885 to 1945, A Photographic History of Cultural Survival. That is an astonishing book. It was published by the University of Washington Press. It won a Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award for Excellence when it appeared in the early 1980s, and it involved elaborate research and interviews with people on the Blackfeet Reservation about photographs that no one had much of an idea about who appeared in them, who these people were. Bill was able to find out and put together this remarkable photographic history of the reservation period on the Blackfeet Reservation. He followed that up with an article in Montana, the Magazine of Western History, called Troubled Bundles, Troubled Blackfeet, that won the Paladin Award in 1993 as the best article published in the magazine, Montana, the Magazine of Western History, in that particular year. A few years later, in 2001, and maybe he'll have occasion tonight to tell us this rather remarkable story of how he rounded a corner in Austria and came upon the work of an Austrian painter who had been in the Blackfeet country just before World War I. But after a couple of years of investigating this fellow, his name was Julius Seiler, Bill wrote an article that was also published in Montana, the Magazine of Western History, called Julius Seiler, Painting the Blackfeet, Painting Glacier Park, 1913 to 1914. Now, there's more to tell you about this particular subject, but I'm working my way from the past to the present in Bill's career in writing about the Blackfeet, so I'll return to that topic in just a second. In 2003 and 2004, Professor Farr published yet another piece in Montana, the Magazine of Western History, this time in two parts. I remember he showed me the original article. I said, Bill, it's way too long. They're not going to publish it in this length. They did end up publishing it. They just gave him 2 issues. And so it appeared in 2 parts. It was called Going to Buffalo, Indian Hunting Migrations Across the Rocky Mountains, Part 1, Making Meat and Taking Robes, and Part 2 was titled Civilian Permits, Army Escorts, and that 2-part piece also won the Paladin Award from the magazine as the best article that was published in the year 2003-2004. More recently, and this book I think is out, has just appeared. It's an edited volume on Walter McClintock, who many of you know as the author of The Old North Trail, and who was a Yalie who appeared on the Blackfeet Reservation in the early 20th century and shot wonderful photographs and wrote a wonderful book about the Blackfeet. This book, brand new book from the University of Oklahoma Press, is called Pictures of Real Life, Walter McClintock and the Montana Blackfeet. It's edited by Stephen Graff, and it includes an essay by Bill that's titled A Point of Entry, The Blackfoot Adoption, or the Blackfeet Adoption of Walter McClintock. And finally, to bring the story up to the present, Bill has a new book coming out. It will be out this fall from the University of Oklahoma Press. It's on that Austrian painter about whom he wrote an article that, as I mentioned a minute ago, named Julius Seiler. And the title of the book is, and you're all going to want to pay close attention to this, Julius Seiler, A German Impressionist Among the Blackfeet, forthcoming in the autumn of 2009. I had the fun about 6 or 8 months ago of reading about half the manuscript for Bill of this particular book, and I told him then, and I still think so, it's the best thing I think he's done. I mean, and he's written all these award-winning books and articles already. I think this is the very best one. It's a book that I think everybody in this part of the world is going to want, and hopefully it's going to be priced so that we can afford it, Bill. I'll have occasion to speak to you again at the conclusion of the talk, because my task, as I said, is to moderate and help you with questions. But for now, let's listen to Bill.
Thank you much. See if I can see you out there. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. As you can see behind us, we have a kind of a local scene. The Sweetgrass Hills, the Buffalo people. And that's what I'd like to talk about tonight. When I was asked about Montana and its hidden myths, the topic of this series, one of the first examples that came to my mind was the kind of curious case of the Blackfeet and their connection with Glacier National Park. How'd they get there? What were they doing there? I see them out here on the plains. I see them out beyond the mountains. How did they get to the mountains? I never quite understood the linkage. The Niitsitapi, or Blackfeet, also known as the Southern Pagan, had really been horse people, equestrians, people of the buffalo, squinting, following like wolves the buffalo and the movements that the buffalo initiated. So how did these plains people, so associated with the upper reaches of the Missouri, the Yellowstone, the Saskatchewan, here hunting buffalo on the Sweetgrass Hills in the early 1850s, how did it happen that they got to Glacier National Park? How did it happen that by the early 20th century, in the minds of most Americans, the Blackfeet acquired a new home amid the towering glaciers and the peaks of the Rocky Mountains? From this to this is quite a shift. From John McStanley's engraving, that steel engraving of the Sweetgrass Hills, to Roland Reed's pictorialism of 1913, what my friend Dan Flores labeled pagans in paradise, that I should have come up with but didn't. Had these Blackfeet been pressured off the plains, something like the grizzly bear, not unlike other animals that were driven away, driven to the westernmost edge of their territories, to what the Blackfeet elders had called the rocks? Well, that's part of the story, because in part they were driven off. But the story is a bit more complicated than that, and that's what I hope to explicate tonight, the subject of tonight's lecture. Well, with the advent of the 20th century, American interest in what had been the frontier West angled towards conservation, preservation, a whole lot of nostalgia, and more than a lot of sentimental yearnings. A good many Americans found recent changes in their country troubling. America wasn't what it had been. They wanted somehow to stem mass migration, particularly of aliens, the swelling tide of modern industrial and urban growth, and certainly the kind of rapaciousness of unchecked exploitation. One reaction was to salvage and protect threatened landscapes and scenic wonders, as Congress had already done with the national parks of Yellowstone in 1872, Yosemite 1890, and with the creation of forest reserves in 1891. When Congress was too late to accomplish this protection legislatively, then people opted for a weak substitute, recording for posterity, or just plain commemoration that would have to do. So, for example, the United States issued the Buffalo nickel in 1913 with its American twin, the Indian, the vanishing Indian, already in the minds of most, already at the end of the trail. Edward S. Curtis began his monumental work, The North American Indian, in 1898, and he was determined to record in pictures and on tape, particularly with text, every phase of Indian life, yet in a pristine state. By 1909, things had progressed to such a degree that the John Wanamaker department stores of Philadelphia and New York staged in Montana a last great tribal council where revered old chiefs could be photographed as the dying of the race, and they could say their farewells. Symbolically, these vanishing first Americans began imperceptibly to merge with other vanishing or threatened elements in the national consciousness. Indians were linked with evolving notions of wilderness, wildlife conservation, and the public's need to pursue what Teddy Roosevelt termed the strenuous life involving healthy outdoor activity. Sometimes it was known as leisure. Well, this was all a very romantic and anti-modern assemblage. And the Southern Piegan of Montana, the Blackfeet, they enjoyed a degree of this national attention because of a number of popular books that George Bird Grinnell, James Willard Schultz, and Walter McClintock had managed to put in bookstores everywhere. In these publications, the Blackfeet were memorialized as the quintessential prairie people. The subtitle of Grinnell's book was The Prairie People. But in subsequent photographs, particularly the work, for example, of Walter McClintock, we see the Blackfeet moving closer and closer to the mountains, to what the Blackfeet had called Mistakis, or backbone of the world. And like caterpillars, they began to mold and to change. They were well on their way to leaving the plains to become, following its creation in 1910, the colorful guardians of Glacier National Park. There they are. There's Two Guns White Calf, son of the old Chief White Calf. He became a part of this story. And yet, oddly enough, the Blackfeet had almost nothing to do with this fanciful transformation that they were going through by becoming, instead of chasers of buffalo, the guardians of Glacier. It wasn't their doing. In fact, the leadership under Old White Calf had sold what was to become the eastern half of Glacier National Park, the so-called ceded strip. They sold it to the United States in the last treaty or agreement 15 years earlier in 1895. This was the mountainous country from the top of the Continental Divide east to where the plains first ran into that first crest of the Rockies. The whites wanted that land because they thought it was full of minerals, consisting primarily of tilted ice, rock, ice, and snow, all above timberline. These glaciated mountains, as far as the Blackfeet were concerned, were only of limited use. And they needed money. It had been 15 years since they sold the last sale of the reservation land, the so-called Sweetgrass Hills, those hills that I showed you earlier, and the money had simply disappeared. The Blackfeet needed more money, money to eat, money to craft an agricultural future, a future that would rest on stock, that would rest on cattle, that would propel them into the future. While not without value, the mountains were thought to be expendable, especially, and note, especially if they could continue to use the mountains as they'd always done, as if they can continue to cut wood, to hunt, to gather, as provided by the agreement of the government in 1895. But they weren't involved really in the development of the park. Nor was it the United States Congress that determined that the Blackfeet would be the putative guardians of their legislative creation. They didn't know anything about the Blackfeet. They knew something about what they called the crown of the continent. That was something that appealed to them. But whether the Blackfeet would play a role into that was open. Instead, surprisingly enough, it was a single individual, a single man, a brash railroader, who put the Blackfeet into the park. His name was Louis W. Hill. He was the president of the Great Northern Railway Company, and he decided that if the Blackfeet weren't located physically where he wanted them to be and where he needed them to be, perceptually, he had the power to move them into a new dimension, into a new reality. And from there, they could become historical custodians, as they said they'd always been, that they had protected this crown of the continent when other tribes wanted to overrun it, and they could be the guardians in the future as well. So they would be the caretakers, in a sense, of Uncle Sam's new park. They'd protected it before, they could do it again. Well, with this kind of can-do attitude in mind, Hill assumed the direction of the railway in 1909. Quietly, he lobbied because he thought it would generate too much political opposition. He lobbied then Senator Thomas Carter, urging Carter for Congress to take action to create the park. And once the park was created, subsequently, he set up a subsidiary company, the Glacier Park Hotel Company, to construct, operate tourist facilities as a concessionaire. And this was his first lodge. It's a big lodge, the Glacier Park Lodge. It cost over $100,000 to build in 1911 and 12. And it kind of functions as the hub for this transportation network that he hopes to build. Hill, together with the Great Northern Publicity Department, then set in motion a really ingenious promotional campaign that was designed to put the Blackfeet, or at least a portion of them, what came to be called the Glacier Park Indians, into this newly created park as a dominant presence and a major attraction. It was a remarkable endeavor. So why did he want them there? What did he have in mind? What did the Blackfeet have to do with Hill's role as a concessionaire? Well, unlike his father, James J. Hill, the original empire builder, the man who had really put together the Great Northern, the Transcontinental Railroad, the last of the transcontinentals. Unlike his father, Louis Hill thought passengers or tourists were going to be important in the coming days and years ahead. They were important for a 20th century railroad. His father, on the other hand, had focused on hauling freight. He'd always said, as his motto, haul no empties. And one of the other things he said was he went so far as to compare passengers to the male teat. Neither very useful nor ornamental. But Hill, Jr. had a different idea, a better idea. Long envious of the Union Pacific with its tourist connections to Yellowstone National Park, and of course the Santa Fe to the southwest, Hill became a strong park advocate, and he was certain that he wanted a park on his line as well as the others. And as early as 1911, he lets us in on his thinking because he said every passenger that goes to the national parks represents practically a net earning. We already have the train facilities. The freight trains are already running. If we add passengers, if we add tourists, we can make a go of it. Tourism, or as it was sometimes known, leisure travel, would be a key element in the new century, especially since the Great Northern was not a land-grant railroad, had no surplus land, extra land to sell. On the other hand, once the park was created, it became clear to everyone that the United States government, now as then as now, had no money. And they had little interest in developing any kind of a park facility or somehow promoting this infant park. Louis Hill, as the park's concessionaire, would have to do that himself, and that's precisely what he did. Between 1911 and 1914, the Great Northern spent literally tens of thousands of dollars constructing hotels, camps, roads, trails, and then somehow trying to persuade a greater America that they should see America first and not go overseas. So buy American. Overnight, Glacier Park became the center of a kind of revved up, highly inventive publicity campaign that kind of made it up as it went along. And the See America First brand became a Great Northern trademark. So what was there for American tourists to see in the park that was called Glacier? Like any good entrepreneur, Hill hedged his bets. He held out not just one, but two or three various options. And what it amounts to is he began to foresee a kind of a theme park with a variety of themes that sometimes were incongruous, sometimes not. Building on the popularity of the Colorado Rockies, and especially the spas, the lucrative spas in Colorado Springs, Hill decided to deem Glacier Park, with its extensive glaciers, the real American Switzerland. Other people had said, oh, it was in Yosemite or it was in Colorado, but he knew better. It would be here, the American Switzerland. He argued that it was every bit as impressive as the European Alps, and yet it was different, better. Instead of inhabiting a world of stone villages and churches and cows, it offered real wilderness. Grizzly bears, elk, mountain lions, mountain goats, all in a kind of natural setting and not in some kind of tricked up zoo. Moreover, Glacier was educational. All you had to do was look around. There were these geological lessons to be learned. It was a botanical wonder. It was an anthropological Eden. It was God's country. It was where God actually sat and then rested. It was a last domain. It was the roof of the continent. It was the beginning. And he just ginned it up. He was called a booster. He was just shameless. But it worked. He very artfully utilized the public's then fascination with vanishing Indian cultures. And so the Great Northern consciously included the Blackfeet in this natural paradise. It was a pairing of wilderness and of a people. And now embraced by the sheltering hotels, protected from a kind of troubled present, the railroad gave a portion of the Blackfeet a new location, a new tourist identity, really, if not a new ethnicity, and they called them the Glacier Park Indians. They had nothing to do with buffalo hunting. They had nothing to do, or very little to do, with down on the reservation, when people stumbling along behind some old mule in bib overalls trying to use a slip scraper to carve out a new irrigation system. No, this was an ethnicity, this was a tourist dimension of the past. These were the Glacier Park Indians. And if they were the ambassadors of an anachronistic past, they became simply more appealing as a cultural attraction. And if these two defining themes did not arouse sufficient interest, Glacier Park was also pitched as the nation's newest playground, where the well-heeled and the well-educated, especially women, could engage in mountain climbing, group trail rides, pack trips, camping, horse wranglers, unparalleled hiking, unparalleled wildflowers, and it was all available, and women should feel safe and be safe with the guardians of glacier at their side, taking them through the park. Here's one picture of them, as you can see, kind of being escorted. And if that weren't enough, what about the Isaac Waltons? There was always fishing. As for trout fishing, Glacier was in a league of its own. Well, to facilitate all of these beguiling themes, and there were more, there was, for example, the Japanese lanterns that were going to be hung in the lodge. These kind of referenced the Oriental Limited that was an important train for the Great Northern. And so you would have Indians and Japanese lanterns and Switzerland and cowboys and Indians and everything else. And you could see really the lure of the wild. This was one of the pitches. See the lure of the wild with the comforts of home. So the Great Northern put together an amazing system of grand hotels, log lodges, Swiss-style chalets, teepee camps for those like me who didn't have the money to stay in the lodge. And they were all connected by roads and stages and lake launches and trails. The architecture, at least much of it, was of Swiss or rustic inspiration. The chalets were located strategically, particularly about the east side of the park. And one of the most important of the lodges was the new lodge that was made in 1915, the Many Glacier Lodge. And there, of course, it was particularly alpine. They all had overhanging roofs, balconies, painted shutters, geraniums, coats of arms from the Swiss cantons. And these structures were supposed to remind Americans that while this was an American Alps, it still had a European flavor about it. And if there were any doubts, waiters soon appeared, dressed, of all things, in lederhosen. And waitresses, or their equivalent, wore something like dirndls, or something that they had imagined was really quite European. And if that were not enough, they decided iron bells ought to be put at the top of the passes. And they couldn't find church bells, of course, so they found locomotive bells. They didn't care about the Park Service permission to put them there. They just put them at the top of the passes, particularly Swift Current and Pig End Pass. And the various horse parties would ceremoniously ring the bells to announce that they had reached the summit, and they would peal out over Heidi Land something, anyway, it was all imagination. As for the Blackfeet, the Great Northern featured them even more prominently in the life of the park on the east side, and was even more inventive in terms of its advertising. As I said, sometimes it featured the Blackfeet with Japanese lanterns. Sometimes you would have Chief Three Bears standing behind the Japanese tea cart, greeting the trains. And if it didn't fit, well, it could make it fit. Assuming the role of knowledgeable ethnographic authorities, the publicity department, led by a guy, I kid you not, his name was Hoke Smith, and he had the hokiest ideas, and he pursued them with a vengeance. Well, he put the Blackfeet right into the park in any number of ways, using magic lantern shows, photographs, paintings, teepees, artifacts, as well as colorful names and legends and stories and crafts. The Great Northern selectively appropriated for itself and its profit the Blackfeet past and anything associated with it, if it would just attract tourists. So there's a never-ending blizzard of printed pamphlets and brochures and calendars. Here's the call of the mountains. Here are a series of calendars advertising the Empire Builder using various Blackfeet individuals. But they went beyond calendars. They also did postcards. Here's Medicine Owl appearing kind of at the edge of the park. They also did match covers, the route of the Empire Builder. They did playing cards. That was always nice. And all of this was to remind prospective tourists of the Blackfeet presence and their involvement in the park. And if that were not enough, the Great Northern lured various kinds of prominent newspaper men from all over the country. They lured them with free vacations in the park and with the expectation that they would write stories about what they had experienced. These were testimonials. They were essentially free advertising. They kind of joined whatever paid advertising the Great Northern was willing to do. And people absolutely loved it. The correspondent of a national popular magazine who was invited out, the magazine was Leslie's, for some of you have heard of it. He was adopted into the Blackfeet tribe by 3 bears. And following that adoption, had to share that experience with everyone else. And without his tongue in his cheek, he wrote a piece that was highly applauded called How It Feels to Be an Indian. Well, it was a stretch, of course. People were interested and wanted more of it. And not only were these eyewitness accounts convincing copy, but they appeared all over in the nation's most important newspapers, and they constituted an important addition to the effective shaping of public opinion as to where the Indians actually belonged. There was a method to his madness. And it wasn't just paper, images, and artifacts. The railroad also hired older Indians, full-blood families, colorful elders, old veterans of the intertribal wars, to come up to the park and be a part of the scene. They were to come up to the park, especially at the main hub, the Glacier Park Lodge, and they would become a kind of living part of the pageantry that had been promised earlier on in print. So they were carefully chosen individuals, families. They were signed contracts. They received $3 a day, given food, and allowed periodically to sell or to pass the tom-tom, according to the Great Northern records. The Great Northern paid them to set up their painted lodges, to camp on the grounds, to dress in all of the traditional outfits with feathered bonnets and ermine-tipped skin shirts, beaded finery, and they were to greet the tourists as they got off the train. They would be there waiting for you, and this is a photograph of, this done in the 1930s. They were there in 1915, they were there in 1920, they were there in 1930. Fred Bigtop, we're told, made every number 3 and 4 train for 60 days in a row and was able to take from 25 to 75 people over to the hotel as they stopped on their way to Seattle as a kind of preview of what they ought to probably be doing the following year. These people would be escorted across the manicured lawns and the perennial gardens that we all recognize, and they would be taken to the impressive forest lobby of the lodge, and there the hotel guests would be further addressed by Indian door girls who ushered them to their rooms or took them to the dining rooms with all of the snowy linen tablecloths. No wonder the Blackfeet had a word for what they saw come off the trains. Their word for tourists was winks as if eyes were dry. Well, the men earned money by conducting popular adoption ceremonies. There were always big wigs that were coming through, people, prominent people who had money, and they would be addressed taken in and given some kind of an adoption ceremony. They would be stood on a blanket amid a throng of people and the thud of the drum and given a colorful name or maybe even an appropriate one. So for an example, President Roosevelt was named Lone Chief. The opera singer Tito Ruffo in 1914, his name was a little more appropriate maybe. It was called Big Thunder. At any rate, these recipients would be shoved into the world ceremoniously as honorary Blackfeet. Here's a picture of the Glacier Park Lodge. As you can see, there are all of the wonderful Japanese lanterns. There's a teepee in the back. Animal hides and heads are everywhere. And this was called the Big Forest Lodge or the Big Timber Lodge. When the Blackfeet adopted a lot of these individuals that I talked about, they were then given a kind of hide skin certificate attesting to the ceremony that they'd participated in. These were done in Blackfeet pictograms, and the inductees, more or less, some more, some less, treasured these graphic mementos. And there are certain individuals like, who really concentrated on selling these certificates or providing these certificates. Curly Bear and others did a brisk business selling postcards in the main lobby of the Glacier Park Hotel and was willing, when he thought it right, to autograph some of those photographs with his distinctive signature. George Bullchild painted deer hides with impressive war records of earlier times and then peddled those as souvenirs. And wives, not to be left out, frequently sold dolls, handmade dolls, and miniature painted teepees. Other Indians drove tour buses, acted as guides, camp rustlers for horse parties, caddied on the golf course. An example of that was Earl Oldperson, an honorary doctorate from the University of Montana. He worked at the hotel in the 30s, and one of the things he did was caddied and then would dance. Sometimes you'd see people like Weaseltail here driving the Glacier Park transportation buses. In other cases, we would see Jenny, the daughter of Many Tail Feathers, who was the so-called hotel hello girl, and she would field all kinds of calls from various people as she operated the switchboard. So these were the Blackfeet that people encountered in the parks of Glacier, in the lodges of Glacier National Park. They were usually in historical garb. They posed for tourist photographers. They danced. They sang. They staged really exciting sham battles as if time had stood still. Some people called it to Indians in aspect. Others said it was as if Indians were in amber. But those Indians, so historically decked out, also led trail rides, stood at the water's edge in this wonderful Roland Reed photograph, preyed on rocky pinnacles, recreated picturesque teepee camps, or sometimes they simply sat or stood silhouetted against a dramatic sky and reminded people that here in Glacier, the past was still available. Was it promotional gimmick? Of course. It was romantic nonsense. Yet Eastern travelers loved it. It was what they'd come for, to see the American frontier that had somehow slipped them by, that somehow they had missed. often now presented and known everywhere across the United States as the Glacier Park Indians, or sometimes the Blackfeet of the Glacier Park Reservation. There were two reservations, one down there on the plains, the other one up at the park. The one dedicated to transforming Indians into citizens, the other dedicated to allowing past tense Indians remain in the past tense. In both cases, the Great Northern Publicity Department not only sent stories and pictures of these stereotypes across the country, they sometimes sent the real thing. So they sent collections, delegations of Blackfeet, men, women, and children, out across the country to various influential organizations who had invited them to major events and who were likely to somehow be instrumental in attracting more tourists. The idea was to pitch the attentions and attractions of Glacier Park and to remind the public that it was still possible to see Indians in a wilderness setting. National magazines Travel and Leslie cautioned, however, scenes like these won't be witnessed long. It was not unlike the current fashion of what the New York Times calls tourism of doom, to yearn to see something before it disappears. Then it was scenes like this. Sometimes it was the last grass dance, threatened because of new tourism. The white men are coming. Now, of course, it was something like, oh, in the light of global warming, are we going to get to see the glaciers of Glacier? Are we going to see polar bears? Are we going to ascend the snowfields of Kilimanjaro? Or closer to home, according to Frommer's Guide and the Missoulian, are we going to get to see the Kootenai River for much longer? At any rate, there was this notion, you better get here now. See it while you can. And with that in mind, the Glacier Park Indians became a big hit. They traveled out to the Rose Festival in Portland. They went to Madison Square Gardens in New York, and there, to the delight of urbanites, they set up their teepees and camped on the roof of McAlpin Hotel and talked about how they lived with skyscrapers too, only they were the mountains of the West. And wherever they went, these kind of ambassadors generated absolute columns of newspaper coverage, photographs beyond count, human interest stories, and public attention. The ambitious national tours were so successful that we better do it again. So one followed the other, including an appearance at the Shriners National Convention in Atlanta, Georgia in 1914, after first visiting Washington, D.C., and once again, New York. The continued promotion was relentless, and it easily morphed and changed as the times changed, so that when newsreels became fashionable, there they were. You could see in a newsreel in the Lyman Howe travelogues, quote, "A day in the life of a Glacier Park Indian." And as the films became lengthier and Hollywood kind of moved in, of course, the Blackfeet in 1939 went to that Hollywood flick, Susanna of the Mounties, starring Shirley Temple and Randolph Scott. You remember Randolph Scott? Handsome old Randolph Scott? Well, the Blackfeet were there as well. So they would just, the advertising changed as we went along. Artists had always been critical in promoting the park. Louis W. Hill was an artist himself. He knew the power of color and image. And this was a time when he started out in 11, 12, 13, 14, when photographs were in black and white. And he wanted color. So he spent something like $50,000 in 1911 alone to purchase oil paintings, including Charlie Russell, for that exhibit, the Land and Irrigation Show in New York. Some of the people he hired were later thought of as frontier Vermeers, sagebrush Rembrandts. Not particularly good, but still interesting. John Ferry, for an example, did so many mountain landscapes in such large size for train depots and land shows that he was accused of being paid by the square yard. Unwilling to limit their exposures to railroad stations, the Great Northern also put their paintings in elegant hotels and clubs in places like New York. For example, in New York, in 1918, paintings were placed in the old moneyed New York Athletic Club, the Yale Club, the Netherlands Hotel, the Columbia University Club, among a host of others. There they could be seen, attract people to come the next summer. These were the well-heeled who had the money to come, and they did. Louis Hill, interestingly enough, in this early stage, didn't forget about the Blackfeet themselves. He hired Blackfeet artists. He was aware of a Blackfeet painting tradition. And he reported in 1915 that the principal decoration in the lobby of the new Many Glacier Hotel was going to be 300 or 400 feet of Indian paintings made by a number of Indians, each one telling the story of his own life. So on instructions of the Great Northern, they hired 25 Blackfeet, again, intertribal veterans, and they were to record in picture writing their war honors, their escapades, their adventures scouting, the times they went horse raiding, how they went with moccasins around their neck on foot, in the expectation that they would come back with a horse. So this Blackfeet painting became known as picture writing of the Blackfeet Indians. And it was important. The aging warriors were given paint and brushes, and each paint, or if they couldn't paint themselves or thought they could find someone else to do it, they would instruct the younger people or those people who were handy with a brush exactly what to do and what to write and how that was to be put down. At any rate, all of these remembered exploits, they laid it out, the muslin stretched out for a very long way, and they just put it down on the ground and painted it up. And then they broke it into sections or panels, and they took those sections out and used it to decorate the walls. Here's an example. This is an example of White Quiver. He was without question the preeminent horse raider, we don't say thief, horse raider of the Blackfeet. He worked way into the 1890s. He was an immense tall man, and he had one episode after another. And so this was the record that was put down for White Quiver. These colorful panels kind of collectively portrayed the Blackfeet's understanding of their own history, of what had been important to them in the Buffalo days, in the war years. And it became so popular, this Blackfeet history, not filtered, not mediated, not translated by someone else, but their own history, became so popular that they published that 24-page booklet entitled Picture Writing by the Blackfeet Indians. Together, the canvases in the booklet, although representing the experiences on the plains in the old buffalo days were just one more step in bringing the history of the Blackfeet into the presence and the mental landscape that constituted the park. While hoping to elevate his advertising art, the frontier Vermeers, the sagebrush Rembrandts, to include, and hoping as well to include more of the Glacier Park Indians, as Dan told you at the outset, Hill invited the German impressionist Julius Seiler to Glacier in the summers of 1913 and 1914. He did a wonderful job. These were kind of abstract, sometimes distorted. They appeared to be sketchy. They weren't fussed over. They were loose, looping, immediate. And yet, they just really didn't seem to have a future for the park, in part because World War I broke out and a patriotic fever swept the country. And in that atmosphere, a German artist of a national park and the American icon, the American Indian, simply would not do. Besides, Seiler, he was romantic enough, but he wasn't representational enough. It wasn't realistic enough for really advertising art. Hill was going to have to wait. He didn't have to wait actually very long. By the middle of the 20s, Hill found his Indian painter in another German artist by the name of Winold Reiss. And you can see Winold here painting a portrait of Buffalo Body. Winold Reiss produced realistic, highly decorative portraits of the Blackfeet. They featured men like Buffalo Body, Lazy Boy, Scalping Woman, or Two Guns White Calf, and reproductions of these portraits not only adorned the Great Northern advertising calendars from 1928 to 1959, they also became collector's items. They became tourist souvenirs. People gathered them up as if they were hotcakes. Rice's cast of Blackfeet characters, just as the people who met the train, they changed over time. The decades passed. The Glacier Park Indians would be replaced by others. Elders died. But the earlier theme of get here before it's too late, while it didn't have the same currency, wasn't fully discarded either. On the other hand, obviously the Blackfeet, after all of these years, were still here. You could still see them. You didn't have to hurry quite so fast anymore. So the Glacier Park Indians now kind of became, once again, the guardians of Glacier, and expanded by Rice's work to include the reservation Blackfeet. These people made an indelible feature, or became an indelible feature on the park that they represented. So what you had here was a kind of a last sanctuary, a new set of twins, no longer the Indian and the buffalo, but this time wilderness and Indians, or locally, Glacier Park and the Blackfeet. One year the calendar featured the emblematic head of guess who? Rocky, the Great Northern Goat. Everyone knew about him. He was there, a familiar logo on the side of the company's freight cars. But the next year, it wasn't the goat, it was Tom Manyguns. And statuesque, there he was with his ermine tails and an eagle feather flan. And they went back and forth. First, these mega fauna creatures that were so intriguing. And on the other hand, the Glacier Park Indians. It was, as you, I think, can see, an elaborate iconography of powerful and often repeated visual symbols, and it linked in an almost interchangeable fashion the distinctive features that could be found in this wilderness playground. Of course, there was criticism. How could there not be? One disgruntled tourist wrote of the Glacier Park Hotel, "This hotel has hired a whole lot of Indians who are to entertain the guests with war dances, and they make such a terrible racket, what they call music, that sleep is impossible." Another suggested that these songs and dances occurring every evening were possibly too much of a good thing. It was impossible to play cards, read, sleep, or otherwise occupy yourself when all that was going on. Those were kind of modest complaints, and there were always people that made them. And the park, trying to respond, said, okay, the next year we're going to set up the lodges 100 yards away from the main lodge, and they can come over only on Saturday and Sunday nights for the weekly powwows. But as another pointed out, people expect them. You can't keep them out. People expect them. It's part of their experience. A more critical criticism, it seems to me, a more fundamental criticism, came in 1923 when the then Blackfeet agent, Fred Campbell, had simply had enough with this corporate exploitation of the Blackfeet. It would seem, he wrote, that the Blackfeet are doomed to furnish cheap amusement to the white man for many, many years to come. This is old Three Bears. I forgot to tell you that not only were there Japanese lanterns in the Glacier Park Lodge, there were also totem poles. There still are. You go to the entrance, and there you see them, totem poles, and you say, what the hell are those totem poles doing here? Other people say, what are the Japanese doing here with their tea carts? What are the Blackfeet doing here? And it was incongruous, but it didn't seem to bother people. It certainly didn't bother them. And here's Three Bears. Well, were the Blackfeet destined to become simply cheap amusement? Were they exploited? Were they used? That's a difficult question to answer. Certainly, many of the pictures offend our sensibility today. But the Blackfeet benefited by employment. They benefited by keeping all their trades, the crafts alive, making moccasins, making teepees, transferring designs, going through adoption ceremonies, singing the old songs, writing the picture writing on various occasions, keeping, in other words, their culture intact, while it was going to hell in a handbasket down on the reservation where everyone wanted to do all of the latest dances for the 20s and go to the creamery to go dancing and to do whatever they did. Well, it's time to conclude. We began with the question of how did the Blackfeet become the guardians of Glacier Park, which really was another way of determining who put or kept the Blackfeet in the conceptual picture. The immediate culprit, as we've already seen, was Louis W. Hill, Mr. Booster himself. Certainly he was aided and abetted by Hoke Smith, old Hokey Smith with the Great Northern Publicity Department. And of course, the Blackfeet themselves participated and helped out. Given the power of advertising, what Hill had in fact done was he had graphically translocated the Blackfeet, first from the prairie and then from the reservation to the eastern half of the park where all of the Great Northern facilities were and where most of the visitors spent most of their time. Over there on the west side, that belonged to the government. That was totally uninteresting. It didn't have the trails, didn't have the development, didn't have the interest. You couldn't see the wilderness in the comforts of home. You couldn't dine on the snowy white tablecloths. All of that was done on the east side of the park. But in the process of doing this, the Great Northern went beyond simply attracting tourists, making a profit, or recovering a proud Blackfeet past. It may have been inadvertent, but Blackfeet tourism helped to define not only how people saw Glacier, but it also made certain that Indians stayed in the wilderness equation of the American West. They stayed there, and they're there today. So the Glacier Park Indians, here's Three Bears, by the way, not standing in front of the Glacier Park Lodge with tourists, but there in what was called the council or the powwow, another Roland Reed photo. So the Glacier Park Indians kept alive the notion that wilderness was malleable, that nature was never monolithic or constant, that it was ambivalent, and you could fill it up with whatever images you wanted to. Advertising and journalism, art, lantern slides, photographic images, stories, legends, all cumulatively allowed no separation between Indians and wilderness. Pristine lands would, of course, retain a kind of an imaginative hammerlock on the American public. People would think in terms of a concept of wilderness in terms of pristine lands, but at the same time, a romantic American public also wanted the Blackfeet, perhaps only past tense, perhaps only theatrical, perhaps only symbolic. They wanted them, still the Blackfeet, in their park. And while the Park Service tried to keep anything but symbolic Indians out, the Great Northern was doing their damnedest to make sure that they were in. And in the end, most of us have come to think of the park that we simply call Glacier, that somehow Indians are a part of it. So the Blackfeet became the guardians of Glacier, an integral part of any kind of park experience. It was as simple as that. They had moved from off the plains, as I showed in that initial buffalo hunting slide of Sweetgrass Hills. They had moved from there into the park, and they were going to remain in the park. By 1950, there were new owners. Hill was long gone. The Great Northern had leased some of it out. They decided that maybe Indians weren't really necessary after all. They took down all of those war records that you could have seen at the Prince of Wales that was built in 1926, or that you could have seen in Many Glacier. Somehow Indians seemed passé. People complained about the costumes were a little worn, a little threadbare, and that Indians were no longer necessary. So they stopped it. 2 years later, they were back. The people wanted them back. It was simple as that. Glacier couldn't be Glacier without the Blackfeet as the guardians of the park. So that's, in trying to describe a myth, I hope to have uncovered it. The guardians of Glacier, I think, are still with us. I suspect with all of you, when you go to Glacier, you still, if you, on the way up, whether it's on the north side, or I'm sorry, whether it's on the east side, driving north of Choteau, where you can squint and peer and see dark shapes of buffalo, is a romantic place, a place that generates the imagination. And somehow, you know, maybe the buffalo simply disappeared into a fold of land only to reappear in just a moment. And expectantly, if you're like me, you drive a little further. As you get onto the reservation lands, you know, the geometric fields kind of peel away, and the old place comes to life. And I have that same feeling, as I suspect you do as well, when you come over the top of, Marias Pass, down by Summit, break out onto the plains. And there, what do you still see? The guardian of Glacier, a new statue standing there on the representing the reservation boundary, and you know you're home. So, the guardians of Glacier, I think, are still with us. Thanks very much.
What we would like to do now is to field questions from the audience. We have not let Bill get away. He's still here with us. And so whoever would like to pose a question to him, please do so. Over here. Okay.
Yeah, I wondered if the panels are still around. Have they preserved those panels?
Some of the panels are still around. Most of them were lost. Some of them are in now in Texas. There is a museum. The Great Northern, of course, sold out, and it's now the Burlington Northern in Santa Fe. And some of them are there, that panel, for example, that you saw with White Quiver. But many of them simply disappeared. Some of them ended up in dumpsters in Browning. They were always, at least that's the mythical report, right? We always like to think of those that got away. But there are very few that have survived. But they're a wonderful record. And people were intrigued at the time because they rolled out something like 300 feet of this muslin or canvas. And there are photographs at the time in the papers of all of the people sitting down and kind of tracing out and writing out these particular stories. One told me that the problem was not with the painting. The problem was you couldn't get by all of the jostling and all of the joshing that went back and forth, and people's attention were always diverted and so on. But they were being paid to record their experiences. And there, kind of like an overseer behind, was an official from the Great Northern handing out the brushes and the paints and make sure that they kept to business. But it's a wonderful record.
Is there a photographic record of these?
Yeah, there's a pretty good photographic record of some of them. There's a new book by L. James Dempsey called Blackfoot War Art. That was, he's a Canadian, so he uses the term Blackfoot, and it's Blackfoot War Art. It was published by the University of Oklahoma, I think 2002. And a number of these are pictured. What's left is pictured, some in color, some in black and white, in that particular volume. Other questions? Yes?
What role did Schultz and Grinnell play in all of this?
Well, it seems to me that, let's take Schultz, let's take Grinnell first. Grinnell was there early. Actually, Schultz was there earlier than Grinnell. Grinnell came out to see Schultz. But Grinnell did a book called Blackfoot Lodge Tales that was really quite popular. And he also ran any number of stories about what he called the crown of the continent in the 1890s, in the late 90s, in his magazine, a national magazine called Forest and Stream. And so he really kind of promoted the Blackfeet. He was adopted by the Blackfeet. In fact, he was made a leader, a Manistokus, and was very proud of that fact. And they expected that he, in fact, would represent them. He had already been instrumental in the starvation winter of 1882-83 in providing for help for them. And they expected a great deal from him, and they got a great deal. And he was of kind of two minds. He really was interested in the Blackfeet cattle industry, really didn't think that the rocks, the crown of the continent, was all that important to them, and of course had been one of the treaty commissioners or agreement commissioners in 1895 when they sold it. White Calf had said, of course, that in selling the rocks, the chief mountain had been his head and the head of the Blackfeet, and now that head was cut off. It had been decapitated. So Grinnell was a very important supporter and promoter of Blackfeet well-being, of assimilation, and had written a lot, not only in his own magazine, but as I said, in the Blackfeet legends and concerns. Schultz, on the other hand, Schultz was a very prolific and popular writer, mainly children's books, but a lot of other things. He did a book called My Life as an Indian, and he really had lived, he had married an Indian woman before the turn of the century, and really came into his own and provided an awful lot of information and stories about the Blackfeet. He knew everyone, Joe Kipp, so many people. On the other hand, he was always drinking. On the other hand, he was always elaborating or kind of embroidering everything that he touched. So I think historians are a little concerned about James Willard Schultz. We use him because he was often the only resource that we have. You'd really rather not, but you use what you've got, and he's an important part of it. Anyway, James Willard Schultz, Grinnell, and McClintock. And E.S. Curtis was there on the Blackfeet Reservation as well. And all of them kind of lifted the Blackfeet into a kind of national recognition, gave the Blackfeet a presence a national presence that they wouldn't have otherwise have had. And so people were interested in them. Yeah?
Where did the term Blackfeet come from? Is that a white nomenclature for the?
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
She said, where did the term Blackfeet come from? Where did the term Blackfeet
Oh.
come from?
Well, there are all kinds of stories associated with how the Blackfeet got their names. Sometimes, frequently your enemies name you. Shouldn't be done to a dog, right? In this case, they saw the Blackfeet coming. They had been through a fire, a prairie fire, and their moccasins were all black. And for that reason, they were called the Blackfeet. But there are lots and lots of stories. That's only one of many. As far as the Blackfoot were concerned, and it's always a kind of an awkward situation, because in Canada they say Blackfoot. The Blackfoot Confederation is made up of Southern Piegans, northern Piegans, many chiefs or bloods or Kainai, and of course the Blackfoot proper Siksika. And together they constitute a kind of Blackfoot nation or a Blackfoot confederacy. They all spoke the Blackfoot language, but the southern Piegans they were known as Blackfeet. And eventually, when they incorporated after the Indian Reorganization Act and had a constitution, they named themselves the Blackfeet tribe. So everyone knows who you mean. It's either Blackfeet or Blackfoot. If you're in Canada, it's Blackfoot. Here it's Blackfeet. The people I know who speak the language, they refer to themselves as Piegans or Pikuni, and they leave it to the younger ones to be the Blackfeet. The younger ones say, look at my feet. I don't have one, do I? I have two. So it shouldn't be Blackfoot, it should be Blackfeet. But the struggle goes on. Other questions? Daniel.
Wasn't there a big, fairly significant chunk of the western edge of the Blackfeet Reservation that is now Glacier Park, or now included within Glacier Park? Wasn't there a section?
Sometimes they called the Blackfeet Indians of the Glacier Park Reservation. Sometimes, more generally, they were simply known as Glacier Park Indians. And they constituted, it was always interesting, the relationship between the park, what were called the Park Indians, and the people on the reservation. People on the reservation said, those families up at the park, right? Up the park, they constitute a group of themselves, of their own. And in fact, they even wrote letters, the Park Indians, saying, we, the Council of the Glacier Park Indians, decide and declare to do this and this and this. So there's a kind of growing separation, but people always recognize that, for the summer they were the Park Indians, and then they went back, of course, home to the reservation for their Heart Butte or wherever. Yeah.
A couple of summers ago, I drove the red buses in Glacier, and we were told that the Blackfeet Reservation used to extend up to the Continental Divide, but the Indians then needed the money, and people had found traces of minerals that they...
Right, the reservation had gone to the Continental Divide. And when the new treaty that was established, actually it was called an agreement, in 1895, it ran from the Continental Divide, then out to where the reservation line now is. Although the old-timers, they always disputed where that line should be. They argued that it had been resurveyed, that what they had sold went from peak to peak, and it was just the rocks and not the parklands and not the long sweep of the valleys and the approaches.
The Blackfeet are now giving tours of the park. They're called the Sun Tours.
Yeah.
You're supposed to tell Blackfoot tales about the park as you go along.
Right.
They're still doing it.
And so the issue continues as to where the park line should be. Other questions? Yes.
This last summer we had a couple of guests from Austria.
Uh-huh.
And they called and we talked, and I said, where would you like to go when you come to Montana? Because they'd spent quite a bit of time in the Alps from Vienna, actually, Vienna.
Right.
And they said they'd like to go to Glacier Park, and they want to see a powwow, as they said it in
Right.
And so I checked around with some of my students at the university, Indian students. I said, where could we go to see an authentic powwow? And they recommended Heart Butte.
Heart Butte, right. Absolutely.
We went to Heart Butte.
So it follows Indian Days. It's 2 weeks later.
Yeah, and it was after the big powwow and running this little tiny one that's going on. It's very authentic. I really recommend you go to this. But it was a very almost sacred event, I felt. It was a wonderful experience for all of us there. And I just wondered what you thought perhaps was lost in the Native American culture, particularly the Blackfeet, as a result of this sort of exploitation. I know they've made money, but do you think anything was lost?
Well, first of all, it seems to me there are relatively few. The Blackfeet, the Indians of Glacier Park, the guardians of Glacier, realistically constituted a very few families. For the most part, that was always up there at the park and didn't really have much to do with what was going on the rest of the reservation, as people struggled to make a living, raise kids, try to keep their cultural traditions alive. What was going on at the park was just a faint glimmer of what was available. And some of the more traditional people, the more traditional elders, participated. But as time went on, fewer and fewer of them. And I think the real responsibility for keeping the traditions alive were down at Star School, at Hart Butte, at a variety of places outside of the park, and had little to do with what was going on there.
You mentioned in passing some hunting and religious ceremony traditions up in the high country.
Right.
I wonder what the traditional connection with that continental divide and the backbone of the world was.
Well, you know, that's a highly disputed and controversial topic. To what degree did the Blackfeet actually occupy or occupy the high country? Certainly they moved through. But on the other side, the Salish and Kootenai were certainly moving through the park as well. There were any number of important passes that were used. Frequently, they didn't go up the Middle Fork and turn left at Bear Creek and go on up to the divide, but would come over from the Swan up into the South Fork and then on up to what becomes Marias Pass and over. But frequently, they would also go up the Nyack Valley, use Pitamakan Pass or Cutbank Pass. There were then, of course, Logan Pass was used. But those Pitamakan and Cutbank Pass were used frequently by horse raiding parties that were going over to the Salish. It was always said, you know, steal the first Salish horse you can. It's bound to be a good one. And the Blackfeet tried to follow that adage as much as they possibly could. On the other hand, the Kootenai and Salish are coming over all the way from South Kootenai Pass down through Waterton Lake and so on, are moving. And when the Blackfeet, following the buffalo, particularly in the spring, would move out on the high plains, then down would come the Kootenai right in behind them to begin either buffalo hunting or sheep hunting and so on. So there's a lot of back and forth. And there's a lot of presence. And we shouldn't expect the kind of occupation that one would normally think of. On the other hand, it seems to me that the historically speaking, not as an archaeologist, but as a historian, it's just very, very difficult to find documented evidence for Blackfeet use on anything other than the Front Range. Chief Mountain, to be sure. Hart Butte, to be sure. Back of Hart Butte. How far back in is another issue, and whether they really spent much time in the earlier years deep in the mountains is an open question. Naturally, as the game disappeared on the reservation, as the buffalo were no longer available, when hunting, if you were going to hunt, you know, you had to go into the mountains. And all kinds of hunting parties went into the mountains for longer periods of time. And even, I think, some of those photographs that I was showing you, these photographs that seem so romantic. They talk about the pathfinders. That's one of the frames. Another is the hunters, or the women with the travois are waiting for the hunters. I mean, there's a lot of activity in the mountains. So it's not exactly as if the Great Northern put them in the mountains, but they made a great deal of their presence, and they gave them a kind of presence like they had not had in the historical past. So that's the answer. Other questions? Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. Just want to make sure you realize we're doing these every Tuesday night for about the next 5 or 6 weeks. So please come again. Thank you.